training course. Port Facility Security Officer. Prepared and conducted by Maritime Bureau of Africa, MBA. For certification and tuition inquiries, please contact MBA by email, director@mbaclass.co.za, or phone +277 2567 0010. Chapter 3. Risk Management and Assessment Principles. 3.1. Port Security as a Risk Management Activity. 3.2. Risk Management, a Foundation for Rational Security. 3.3. Port Facility Security and the Risk Assessment Process Levels of Probability. 3.4. Risk-Based Decision-Making. 3.5. Cost-Effective Risk Assessment Recommendations for Developing Efficiencies in Risk Assessment Strategies. 3.6. Risk Assessment Survey. Identify assets, establish criticality, determine vulnerability, determine probability. 3.7. Quantification of risk. The management of risk in any human endeavor requires careful and objective consideration of the environment within which one is operating. In the business of security, the risk management process begins with understanding the target environment as being fraught with risks that must be identified, assessed, and managed. Example of a fairly routine activity, which occurs at ports every day: a tanker truck servicing a vessel at a dock. It could be a fueling operation, a water truck servicing a port utility system, or a waste disposal company removing wastewater from a passenger cruise vessel during turnover in the port. The activity is a routine and necessary port-vessel interface operation. However, we may look at it from security perspective and ask some questions. What risks may be associated with it? Did the port receive advance notice of the vehicle's arrival on the day and time scheduled? Do the vehicle driver and any occupants possess a port or government-issued credential, which positively identifies them and provides advanced authorization to be in this particular restricted area? Has the truck been subjected to a thorough screening, to establish that there are no hazardous devices or weapons being introduced into the port's restricted access area? Has the vehicle operator provided a manifest of the materials or products being brought into the port? These questions and others present the Port Facility Security Officer, FSO, with a risk management foundation for identifying threats and vulnerabilities associated with the business of running a port. Port Facility Security and the Risk Assessment Process. Port FSOs have a legal and moral responsibility to develop strong facility security plans, FSPs, based on a normative assessment of risk, in concert with government regulations and maritime interests business models. Information is crucial to assessing the port facility's exposure to harm. Expertise in assessing the essential areas of risk pertinent to port facilities, for example, accidents, theft, natural disasters, and particularly terrorism, is an essential element of ensuring that risk assessments are accurate and supportable. There is a critical need for accurate data on costs associated with the mitigation of risk in a business environment, where economic realities demand that port managers focus clearly on port users' strengths and constraints. While there are many alternative strategies for securing the port, the costs of mitigating risk exposure can be a source of conflict among port users, and governmental authorities with a legal responsibility for port security. One prescription for managing port security efficiently is to model risk assessments rationally, by engaging port users and stakeholders more directly in the risk assessment process. A risk management process is a comprehensive identification of the possible harm faced by an organization. It entails a systematic examination of the exposure to risk, including those where persons and property may be harmed, or where financial losses might occur. What may be problematic in the post-9/11 security environment is a clear understanding of how to assess risk. What are the appropriate sources and uses of information? In a process that involves estimating and measuring the frequency and severity of risks, what strategies will work best to ensure both a strong security posture and adherence to cost efficiencies? Risk management is a process of identifying and developing alternatives to minimize risk exposure. What measures will be used to integrate security requirements and to fund the costs of unavoidable risks? The process entails administering, reviewing, and improving the security program, to protect the assets and to minimize costs. In the complexity of the modern maritime environment, it is essential that ports engage both users and interested public and private stakeholders in the risk management process. As with most businesses, maritime interests must strike a balance between efficiency and effectiveness. The trade-offs involved, when a business is focused on bottom-line efficiencies at the expense of product or service development, cannot be underestimated. One view on the organizational strategy: when the market is more concerned with product and service features and up-to-date technology, a firm, pursuing efficiency, can find itself offering a low-priced product that few customers want. A port focused on efficiency at the expense of security enhancements, that may offer a higher level of protection, may shortchange itself in the long run. Strategic decisions with respect to the pursuit of market share must balance cost reductions against non-cost price marketing effectiveness. The primary competing interests in the port environment are quite basic: commerce versus security. To put it another way, there is a need to balance two diverse imperatives: time is money versus security is paramount. The dilemma for port security management is deciding what levels of security can be implemented without having a deleterious effect on budgetary policy and commerce. Besides port management and port users, there are other stakeholders with competing priorities. National Maritime Security Strategy provides a framework for risk management that port security managers can adapt as they begin to understand the cycle of decision-making that revolves around the development of a port's FSP. Identify and establish strategic goals and objectives within the context of organizational constraints. Assess the security risks faced by the port. Determine what alternatives exist for addressing those risks. Determine which alternatives to implement. Implement the solutions and monitor progress and results. In the global maritime sector, risk assessment has taken on increased importance in the post-9/11 environment, particularly subsequent to the International Maritime Organization's 2004 adoption of the International Ship and Port Facility Security (ISPS) Code. Levels of probability. Washington State emergency managers were using a simple formula, history plus judgment equals forecast, to determine the probability of a wide range of hazards, from terrorist attacks to tsunamis, wildfires or an explosion. Risk assessment models may be science-based, but they still require decisions to be made with a certain amount of unpredictability. As the port FSO begins developing a risk management strategy, it will not be long before organizations marketing risk management products and services become evident. Part of the dilemma for port security managers, especially with respect to assessing the risk of terrorist activity, is determining the probability of a terrorist attack. Risk-based decision-making. Strictly speaking, risk can be understood as the possibility of harm or loss. It includes an element of uncertainty in the sense that the actual outcomes of security policy and action may be inconsistent with anticipated outcomes. In the basic security environment, organizations consider various types of risk associated with loss or harm. Risks such as personal injury crimes, for example, robbery, and property crimes, for example, burglary, theft, and vandalism, have long been the focus of assessment activities associated with crime prevention in commercial settings. Other risks associated with natural disasters, for example, hurricanes and tornadoes, man-made disasters, for example, hazardous materials incidents, and human conflict, for example, civil unrest, labor strife, and workplace violence, are considered in many specialized security environments. In the early 21st century, organizations considering security needs must assess new risks associated with technology, for example, computer crime and identity theft, and violence, for example, terrorism. The following figure is a conceptualized understanding of the generalized flow of the risk assessment process, and illustrates how risk-based decisions are made within a type of systems feedback loop. The process begins with asset identification. The FSO must understand that a program of protection and mitigation begins with an understanding of each and every asset under his command and control. Once a consolidated list of assets is developed, the security manager engages in a multi-step process of identifying and defining the threat associated with each asset. A vulnerability assessment evaluates facility design and layout issues against the types and levels of threats envisioned. A criticality assessment establishes the value of the asset to the continuing mission of the organization. This process leads to a determination of the level of protection necessary for each mitigation measure against the threats identified. See diagram on page 19. Risk-based decision-making entails continuous system feedback assessments of the impacts of mitigation measures on asset vulnerability and criticality. For example, in many ports, waterside docks and piers are considered necessary assets, as they relate directly to the ability of vessels to moor and be serviced. A dock is highly critical to the port's success, as a viable commercial function. Docks are vulnerable to a threat of terrorist activity in that personnel and vehicles, which may be able to transfer dangerous weapons and devices onto the port, must be able to service a docked vessel. An option for neutralizing the threat, that dock workers could be a conduit for weapons that could threaten a docked vessel, might be to conduct physical screening of every individual and vehicle accessing the dock. The effect of this decision on the dock's vulnerability is that the threat from this potential terrorist attack is reduced. The criticality of the dock is also affected, because enhanced screening may slow down work processes associated with vessel servicing. These assessments must be factored into a continuing risk assessment process, which is enhanced by the flow of information about changing vulnerabilities, threats, and criticality values associated with port assets. The general purpose of risk assessment is to determine the degree of exposure to hazards or dangers to personnel and property, as a preliminary step to identifying preventative measures to minimize risk. The most effective course of action in safeguarding the target environment is to eliminate the source of the risk. Analysis of operations is a component factor of risk assessment. The elimination of risks of criminality, terrorism, and natural and man-made disasters is a function of organizational management, but there may be a government enforcement function. For example, regulated industries, such as transportation, aviation, and energy systems, that provides input to the strategic direction of risk assessment. Risk management is concerned with identifying preventative measures to implement that will focus on minimizing the risks. It can, therefore, be said that security risk assessment is a form of risk-based decision-making geared toward determining an acceptable level of risk. The assessment requires the organization to answer three basic and important questions. 1. What types of security risks, that is, threats, does the facility face? 2. How viable are those risks? 3. Why? Risk-based decision-making, thus, balances the concept of security against three organizational constraints. 1. Access. Security measures may restrict use of the facility, which could affect the organization's maximization of its productivity. For example, when heightened levels of security are implemented, facilities may restrict access to certain individuals, companies, or elements. 2. Commerce. Security measures may entail direct and indirect costs associated with the business function. For example, costs associated with the procurement of access credentials may be factored into end-user costs. 3. Environment. Security measures may require that more capital resources be devoted to security versus commercial use. Thus, a facility may have to incorporate staging areas, screening points, buffer zones, and protected zones into the physical plant. Thus, port security risk assessment is a process that leads the port security manager to make security-related decisions based on a determination of what is an acceptable level of risk. The assessment process entails an examination of three fundamental considerations. 1. What types of threats and vulnerabilities does the port facility face? 2. How viable are those threats, and what is the extent of the vulnerability? 3. What can be done to eliminate or mitigate these threats and vulnerabilities? Cost-effective risk assessment. Organizations assessing risk, as a prelude to the development of security plans and procedures, make decisions that realistically influence the ability of the organization to conduct its core business functions. Risk management necessitates that organizations select from one of three choices. Do nothing and accept the risk, perform a risk assessment and manage the risk, by installing reasonable mitigation measure, harden the building against all threats to achieve the least amount of risk. There are several strategies that port security organizations can integrate into their risk assessment processes, that will help FSOs to engage the wider port community in more cost-effective risk assessment. Recommendations for developing efficiencies in risk assessment strategies. Use a risk assessment model that considers all stakeholders' interests and concerns. Seaports are complex and dynamic environments. In many cases, elements of the private sector and government must work cooperatively, anticipating the many strengths and constraints each organization possesses. Port FSOs should engage each interested party in the risk assessment process, using a model that addresses each user's unique business needs. Get buy-in from the Seaport community. The best way forward is the one in which all parties in the process perceive their input as valued and desired. The resolution of conflicting interests and the cooperation of users in a risk assessment process that meets the needs of the Seaport community are essential steps in developing efficiencies in security management. Ensure security staff understands risk management. Part of being efficient is ensuring that the security staff understands the risk assessment process. Management and training activities should be structured such that staff understands the process and can be engaged productively in risk assessment activities. Seaport stakeholders' values must be internalized by security and top Seaport management. Efficiencies in risk assessment will depend on whether or not the Seaport is in a position to understand the business and organizational values of its end users. Is port management focused on understanding the strategic directions of its core businesses? To assess security risks properly, the Seaport must understand the business of its clientele. When conducting risk assessments, decide to use internal staff or outside experts, based on an assessment of strengths, weaknesses, and costs. In a complex Seaport environment, will internal staff be sufficiently knowledgeable of systems and computer models used in complex risk assessments? Consider carefully the trade-offs involved in using outside consultants. If subject matter expertise is needed, be prepared to justify the expenses to engaged users and stakeholders, as well as senior port leadership. Have frequent meetings with stakeholders, both individually and in groups, to obtain their concerns, answer their questions, and solicit suggestions. Communication in the risk assessment process is the cornerstone of conflict resolution. The port tenants and users have a stake in the process and the outcome. It is likely that their input and suggestions will enable port FSOs to identify factors relevant to the assessment. To the extent that the Seaport end users and stakeholders both understand the risk assessment process and are a viable part of it, port security managers can achieve efficiencies. Security Survey. CAIR is an acronym for Understanding the Process of Assessing Risk. It stands for Collect, Analyze, Improve, and Re-evaluate, and represents a constant process of understanding the risks in the facility and rationally developing solutions for minimizing potential harm. Collect information and data about all of the possible security risks inherent in the port facility is collected and organized. Analyze. The information on these risks is examined to understand what options and alternatives are feasible for implementation in mitigating each identified risk. Improve. Existing security processes, structures, and systems are improved by selecting which risk mitigating strategies will be implemented. Re-evaluate. The solutions that have been implemented are checked continuously to ensure the intended outcomes are being met. System failures, such as breaches of security, will necessitate the CAIR cycle be repeated for the particular risk. In conducting risk assessments at port, the FSO's primary goal is a determination of the vulnerability of the port facility's assets to hazards or dangers caused by natural or other forces, and using this information to construct a security plan. The CAIR process then is concerned with identifying preventative measures to implement, that will focus on minimizing the threats to the port facility. To begin the risk management process at the port, the FSO must conduct a security survey. Security surveys have 5 essential components, which are discussed next. 1. Identify assets. 2. Establish criticality. 3. Determine vulnerability. 4. Determine probability. 5. Determine consequences. Identify assets. This first step involves constructing a general and specific layout of the port facility, to identify important assets and infrastructure that are critical to the port, as well as those areas or structures that, if damaged, could cause significant loss of life or damage to the port's organization, facility, local economy, or environment. The determination of what is a port asset or what is port infrastructure will vary and depend on the type of port business, organization, or facility, but will generally include buildings, roads, transportation networks, equipment, intermodal connections, for example, pipelines and railroad access, user assets, for example, vessels, road vehicles, stevedore equipment, and shipping containers, support systems, for example, information, communication, and management systems, and power and water distribution systems. A complementary aspect of this asset identification step is the articulation of the location of all access points to the facility. In small ports, this may only entail a localized survey of adjacent roads and waterways. In large ports, especially those serving a complex urban, regional, or national economy, asset identification and access point articulation may entail more sophisticated surveys, which consider intersections of the port with highways, bridges, and road and rail connectors within the larger metropolitan area. In fact, if the port is engaged in significant commercial interfaces, for example, a significant passenger cruise industry with dedicated links to airports, the port security manager may need to conduct joint security surveys with counterparts in airports, rail depots, truck transfer stations, and similar organizations. Establish criticality. Once a comprehensive understanding of the port's assets and infrastructure is developed, the second step of the port security survey focuses on establishing the criticality of each asset. The PFSO must answer this question: what is the value, impact, or cost of any asset, should it be lost as a result of natural or other forces? By establishing priorities of criticality, that is, assigning priorities to those areas most critical to the port's survival, an objective assessment can be made for devoting precious security resources to those assets, deemed essential for port operations and viability. Conversely, the non-critical areas will receive lesser priority for protection. The survey must verify actual conditions and procedures relative to each asset, and the survey results must be shared with port management and affected port users, to arrive at consensus as to the prioritization of security concerns. Obviously, the assessment must identify the actual threats to those critical assets and infrastructure, to prioritize security measures. A criticality assessment is a process designed to systematically identify and evaluate important assets and infrastructure in terms of various factors, such as the mission and significance of a target. For example, nuclear power plants, key bridges, and major computer networks might be identified as critical in terms of their importance to public safety, national security, and economic activity. In addition, facilities might be critical at certain times, but not others. For example, large sports stadiums, shopping malls, or office towers may represent an important target only when in use by large numbers of people. Criticality assessments are important, because they provide a basis for focusing the mitigation strategies and implementation methods on the most important items, by identifying which assets and structures are more crucial to protect from an attack. Criticality assessments consider such factors as the importance of a structure to the missions of the port, the ability to reconstitute this capability, and the potential cost to repair or replace the asset. Criticality assessments should also give information on impacts to life, economic security, symbolic value, and national defense. Criticality assessments provide information to prioritize assets and determine which potential targets merit further evaluation. Criticality assessment format. See table on page 23. Determine vulnerability. Vulnerability refers to how prone a particular person, asset, system, function, or process is to injury, death, damage, loss, or disaster. A vulnerability assessment is a process that identifies weaknesses in physical structures, personnel protection systems, processes, or other areas that may lead to a security breach and may suggest options to eliminate or mitigate those weaknesses. For example, a vulnerability assessment might reveal weaknesses in physical security, structural integrity, protection systems, procedural policies, communications systems, transportation infrastructure, utilities, water supplies, bridges, and tunnels, and other areas within a port facility that may be a likely target. In general, teams of experts should conduct vulnerability assessments. In a general risk management environment, we might consider a particular structural asset's vulnerability in relation to its survivability. Were it exposed to fire, storms, earthquakes, and other natural or man-made disasters? From a more specific national security or emergency management perspective, we may consider vulnerability in terms of how likely it is that a disaster may occur and that an organization or individuals may experience negative impacts from the event, such as injuries, death, property damage, and financial losses. For example, at many passenger terminals, experts have identified security concerns, including the distance from parking lots to important staging areas and buildings, as being so close that a car bomb detonation would damage or destroy the buildings and kill people in them. To mitigate this threat, experts have advised to increase the distance between parking lots and buildings. Another security enhancement might be to reinforce the windows in buildings to prevent glass from flying into the building if an explosion occurs. Such assessments can identify vulnerabilities in port operations, personnel security, and physical and technical security. In determining the vulnerability of port assets and infrastructure, the primary question to be answered is, what is the degree of vulnerability of the asset to damage or attack? The answer to this will be determined by an inspection, which must look at physical and operational weaknesses, peak versus off-peak activities, relative sizes of assets, for example, small versus large buildings, how the assets are used, for example, high public traffic versus restricted, exposure to natural forces, for example, weather, environment, and hazardous materials. Exposure to terrorist activities, for example, piracy, geography, ideology, and political landscape. What actually goes on in the business, for example, cash handling, baggage conveyance, and container movements. What are the weak points in security, physical and human? What is the history of losses, for example, crime reports, accidents, weather events, fire, security incident report, insurance losses, lawsuits, workers' compensation injuries, media reports, industry and trade data, government report, and academic research. The potential for internal conspiracies, for example, illegal narcotics and cargo theft. After criticality, threat, consequence, and vulnerability assessments have been completed and evaluated in this risk-based decision process, key actions can be taken to better prepare against potential terrorist attacks. Following is an approach for risk-based port security assessment that can be further refined and tailored to specific ports or port facilities. The overall steps of port security assessment are: 1. Perform a criticality assessment to identify critical activities or operations. This helps identify critical targets with the port, allowing them to be the focus of further assessments. For small ports or individual port facilities, a criticality assessment is not likely to be needed. 2. Conduct a threat and probability assessment, to define scenarios by combining threats with credible attack scenarios. 3. Conduct consequence and vulnerability assessments for each target scenario combination using a high, medium, low score based on descriptors of specific elements in tables 2, 3, 4, and 5. Table 2 lists several consequence classes. Table 3 lists several consequence assessment criteria. Table 4 lists vulnerability classes to consider. Table 5 lists vulnerability criteria. 4. Categorize the target and scenario combinations using Table 6. Table 6 prioritizes scenarios by organizing them into 3 categories: those for which mitigation strategies should be developed, those that should be considered on a case-by-case basis, those that do not need mitigation strategies and need only to be documented. A consequence assessment evaluates the negative impact of a successful attack. It is a method to evaluate the likely outcomes of a scenario. The consequence analysis promotes the consideration of an attack's impacts, including deaths and injuries, economic impacts, public safety, national defense effects, environmental impacts, symbolic effect. This assessment evaluates the consequence term of the risk equation. See tables on page 25. Determine probability. Another component of the security survey is a determination of the probability or likelihood that a particular event or occurrence will compromise security of the port facility. Probability assessment is used to evaluate the likelihood of attack against a given asset or location. It is a decision support tool that helps to establish and prioritize security program requirements, planning, and resource allocations. A threat assessment identifies and evaluates each threat on the basis of various factors, including capability and intention. By identifying and assessing threats, organizations do not have to rely on worst-case scenarios to guide planning and resource allocations. Worst-case scenarios tend to focus on extreme consequences and typically require too much resources to address. In determining probability, the logical way forward is to make reliable estimates, based on past data and experience. Consider the potential threat in terms of its likelihood of occurrence. The plan for security in relation to the threat is concerned with improving the ratio of favorable events to unfavorable events, or to reduce the ratio of unfavorable events. In other words, if one perceived threat in a port environment is a fire on board a passenger cruise vessel, while it is docked at a port terminal, reliable estimates of the potential risk can be obtained by looking at historical data on fires aboard vessels and experiences of the passenger cruise industry. The probability of such a fire occurring in the facility can then be expressed. The likelihood of the event actually occurring will be reduced by the deployment of security strategies, such as systems, for example, alarms, monitors, and fire suppression processes, for example, ship staff training in fire prevention and passenger orientation to combustible conditions and materials, for example, use of fire retardant materials on cruise ships, to name a few. While it is not feasible or wise to discount the likelihood of any injurious event occurring in a port, the rational planning process that considers probability in the security survey provides for objectivity in the risk management planning process. While threat assessments are a key decision support tool, it should be recognized that they are dependent on intelligence data. Even if updated often, threat assessments might not adequately capture emerging threats. No matter how much we know about potential threats, we will never know that we have identified every threat or that we have complete information even about the threats of which we are aware. Threat assessments alone are insufficient to support key judgments and decisions that must be made. The ISPS Code and U.S. Coast Guard guidance documents do not provide an approach for threat assessment. Even when a detailed threat assessment is not available, the consequence and vulnerability assessments provide a measure of how attractive a target is, which is a measure of threat. Display table on page 26. Mitigate means that mitigation strategies should be developed to reduce risk for the target and scenario combination. A security plan should contain the scenario evaluated, the results of the evaluation, and the mitigation measures. Consider means that the target and scenario combination should be considered, and mitigation strategies should be developed on a case-by-case basis. The port security plan should contain the scenario evaluated, the results of the evaluation, and the reason mitigation measures were or were not chosen. Document means that the target and scenario combination does not need a mitigation measure at this time, and therefore needs only to be documented. The security plan should contain the scenario evaluated and the results of the evaluation. This will be beneficial in further revisions of the security plan in order to know if the underlying assumptions have changed since the last edition of the security assessment. An attack scenario consists of a potential threat to a unique target or target class under specific circumstances. It is important that the developed scenario or scenarios are within the realm of possibility and, at a minimum, address known capabilities and intents, as evidenced by past events and available intelligence. For example, a boat containing explosives, a specific class of scenario, ramming a tanker, target, that is outbound through a choke point, specific circumstance, is one credible scenario. it is much less credible that a National Navy warship will be commandeered and used to ram a bridge, unless specific intelligence reports indicate otherwise. The ISPS Code and the U.S. Coast Guard regulation provide a list of scenarios that should be combined with specific critical targets to develop the scenarios to be evaluated in the port security assessment. Those scenarios include damage to, or destruction of, the port facility or of the ship, for example, by explosive devices, arson, sabotage or vandalism. Hijacking or seizure of the ship or of persons on board. Tampering with cargo, essential ship equipment, or systems or ship's stores. Unauthorized access or use, including presence of stowaways. Smuggling weapons or equipment, including weapons of mass destruction. Use of the ship to carry those intending to cause a security incident and their equipment. Use of the ship itself as a weapon or as a means to cause damage or destruction. Blockage of port entrances, locks, approaches, etc. Nuclear, biological, and chemical attack. Quantification of risk. Once all components of the security survey have been completed, port management can objectively assess the risks to the port and begin to conceptualize and initiate the FSP. The process is essentially a systematic evaluation of the port's security strengths and weaknesses, measured against identifiable threats, leading to a risk profile baseline and evaluation as to where the port facility lies in reference to security. Risk assessment is in some respects a subjective process, but if undertaken systematically, it is also a quantifiable activity. R equals C multiplied by V multiplied by P, where R equals risk, C equals criticality, V equals vulnerability, P equals probability. This formula illustrates the formulaic components of the risk quantification process. Consider the following example within the context of the four-step security survey process. 1. Identify the asset. Suppose the port operates a passenger cruise terminal facility. It consists of a terminal building with associated intermodal connections for passenger and baggage movement, processing of ticketed passengers, boarding systems, embarkation processes, docks and associated utility systems, and equipment for provisioning and maintenance. The port identifies the terminal as an essential asset, critical to the port's viability. 2. Establish criticality. C. In establishing the criticality, for example, value, impact, or cost, if lost, of the terminal, for security planning and prioritization purposes, one could estimate the harm on a scale from 0 to 5, with 0 referring to insignificant harm, no impact on port operations, and 5 referring to grave harm, permanent shutdown of port operations. Consider the scenario of a damaging fire that might cause a shutdown to part of the terminal facility and a significant expenditure of resources to keep at least some of the terminal operations going while repairs are made. In this case, the criticality factor, C, may be 3 on the scale. 3. Determine vulnerability, V. Assume the terminal is vulnerable to fire. A numerical rating scale can be constructed, which considers both the impact of the harm on the port, and the availability of resources in mitigating the fire's impact. For instance, using a scale from 0 to 5, no impact to high impact, One could estimate the impact of a fire in each of these three areas: human impact, high, property impact, by, and business impact, by. One can also construct a numerical scale from 0 to 5, strong to none, to consider the strength of both the port's internal resources, ears, and external resources, ears. Using these numerical ratings, the most vulnerable areas will be those with the highest total. High plus pi plus by plus ear plus equals vulnerability, V. High V equals 25. Low V equals 0. Consider the following scenario: if the terminal fire only destroyed property, with no deaths or injuries to people, the high would be none or 0. There will likely be a by due to loss of revenue from use of the terminal and a pi due to construction or repair costs. Thus, the by and by values could both be high or 5 for each. Next, consider the port's ears and ears. If ears included a well-trained security guard force, with firefighting expertise and capabilities, then the port's ear value might be considered strong or 1. If the port's ears were adequate, for example, a quick, on-port fire department response capability, the port might calculate a moderate ear value or 3. Thus, values have been determined to calculate a vulnerability, V, factor for the terminal given a fire threat scenario. V equals high plus pi plus by plus ear plus ear. V equals 0 plus 5 plus 5 plus 1 plus 3. V equals 14. 4. Determine probability, P. What is the frequency of the threat occurring in the port facility? In other words, in this example, what is the likelihood that a fire will destroy the terminal? There will be a need for some research here to assess this realistically. For example, records maintained by the port, city, and state, or perhaps industry research on ports worldwide, could be reviewed to identify past incidents or trends associated with the particular risk. Make an educated assessment based on the best data available. Again, construct a scale, see Table 4.1, to assess the probability of each threat occurrence. For instance, based on the research, one might assess the likelihood of a terminal fire as occurring once every 10 years. Using the scale in Table 4.1, the probability, P, factor would be very low or 1. There are now C, V, and P factors to plug into the risk, R, calculation. R equals C multiplied by V multiplied by P, where R equals risk, C equals 3, V equals 14, P equals 1. R equals 3 multiplied by 14 multiplied by 1. R equals 42. By itself, the R value of 42 is unclear, because it must be assessed relative to the port's other identified assets and threat scenarios. In assessing and quantifying risks, the port security manager must use a comparable methodology, assessing all identified assets and considering both physical and human resources. Risk values for individual assets in the port facility can be used to balance each asset against alternative protective measures identified to reduce the port's exposure to various threats and scenarios. Using the terminal fire example above, assume the security plan attempts to mitigate the threat of fire by installing a sprinkler system in the terminal. Objectively, the vulnerability to fire will be reduced because the ears are now stronger. The recalculated risk factor would also be reduced. The values become meaningful when they are used as a framework for comparing and prioritizing assets with respect to identified threat scenarios, considering each asset's criticality and vulnerability, and the probability of occurrence. The risk quantification, of course, can be done using a variety of methodologies, as well as sophisticated algorithms and software tools, available in the marketplace to the security manager. The above example is intended to illustrate how one can rationally quantify a risk and compare alternative security solutions to specific threat environments. It demonstrates that the port security manager can weigh the pros and cons of alternative security solutions, relative to perceived threats, and justify security expenditures to port management, users, and government officials regulating port FSPs. Display table on page 31. For port security managers, the risk management process begins with understanding the target environment, as one having hazards that must be identified, assessed, and managed. Risk management helps security planners allocate resources and take actions under conditions of uncertainty. Port security managers must understand the impact that security measures have on the business of the port. A systems approach to risk management will place the port's security manager in a position to interact vertically and horizontally with the port's organizational structure. The framework for risk management revolves around the development of a port's FSP. Identify and establish strategic goals and objectives within the context of organizational constraints. Assess the security risks faced by the port. Determine what alternatives exist for addressing those risks. Determine which alternatives to implement. Implement the solutions and monitor progress and results. End of Chapter 3 audio file.